This movie is about the relationships established between cells in the form of dependencies. We're going to use some Excel functionality to trace precedents, which are the cells that are upstream in the calculation sequence that are providing values to other cells. We're going to trace dependents, which are cells that are downstream in the calculation sequence that are depending upon values generated from other cells. And we're going to do both of those things by setting up dependency arrows, which we can remove with a click. And then we're going to use a shortcut key to select all of the cells for which that cell is dependent. And conversely, we'll use a shortcut key to select all of the cells that are dependent upon the active cell. So this movie is about precedence and dependence, and it's the relationship of the references between the cells that we're going to walk through and display. We're going to start with precedence. And to do that, we're going to begin in the last cell that's in a chain of a calculation sequence, which is going to be this one, F17. So if I want to find out what cells are feeding F17 or where that value is coming from, I can of course press F2 to get F17 in the edit mode, and I can see that F17 is deriving its value from D17 and E17, but D17 and E17 are also having their values derived. In the case of D17, it's from those two cells, E10 and E15, and E15 has its value derived yet from three other cells. So what if I want to graphically display all of these relationships at one time instead of sequentially selecting active cells and pressing F2? Well, you can do that. I'm going to go back to F17, make that the active cell, go to the Formulas tab, and left-click Trace Precedents. So when I do that, Excel displays some arrows in the cells, which actually at this point haven't told me anything more than I could have found out by pressing F2 when I was in F17. But when I press Trace Precedents again, I get another tier displayed in the calculation stream. So now I know that E17 derives its value from E10 and E15. Clicking Trace Precedents again, I see that E15 derives its value from the values that are in E12, 13, and 14. And when I look at cell D10, Excel is displaying that that precedence is actually coming from another worksheet. That's what that black dotted line tracing back from a little icon of a worksheet means. Well, I can double-click that dotted line and automatically get the Go To dialog box where I can select the location that is the precedent for, in this case, cell D10, and then left-click OK, and go to the worksheet that has that cell that's the precedent for, in this case, D10. And of course, I can continue to press Trace Precedents until I don't get any more arrows displayed. I'm going to remove the precedent arrows and go back to our other worksheet and remove the arrows there as well, and set these up once again. When I click the Trace Precedents, I get a straight line with an arrow to F17 and a dot in D17 and E17. So I've got three symbols at this point. I've got a line, I've got an arrow, and I've got a dot. The arrow is the termination point of the line, which runs through D17 and E17, each of which have a dot. So this really shows the direction of the calculation that's going on in F17. F17 is picking up the value for D17 and E17. When I click Trace Precedents again, I see the same sort of thing. I see a line running from E10 that then includes the value that's in E15, and both of those cells are determining the value that's in E17. Now, one negative thing about this is the first precedent arrows that we established is an addition. D17 plus E17 equals F17. The second set of precedent arrows is a subtraction, and you can't visually tell the difference between the two. It would be nice if Excel displayed the subtraction in a different color than the addition, but that doesn't happen. Left-clicking Trace Precedents again, I now have a box that's been placed around cells E12 to E14 and cells D12 to D14. Those are ranges or groups of cells that are included in the determination of the value that is, in this case, cell E15 and D15. And of course, we already talked about how Excel displays the precedence that's coming from another worksheet. So I'm going to clear those again, remove the arrows, and go to sheet 1 and start at the beginning or the other end of the calculation stream. And I'm going to trace dependence. And we'll have the same sort of thing displayed, only the direction of the arrows is going in the other direction. So we begin in cell C10. C10's value is included with C12's value. In this case, it's subtracted to give us a value in C14 of 161.25. And C10's value is also included horizontally. And in this case, it's added to all of the values that terminate in cell O10. Clicking Trace Precedence again. Now we see our worksheet referenced coming out of cell O10 that references back to the worksheet that we started on. Clicking Trace Dependence one more time. We see that the other values in O12 and O14 are also carried to another worksheet. And once again, I can remove the dependency arrows. And I can choose to remove the precedent arrows or the dependent arrows in case you have both of them displayed at the same time. So back on our worksheet, I've made H18 the active cell, and the value in H18 is a value that's derived from a calculation sequence that's contained within the cells in the range H7 to K16. But once again, if I press F2, I only get a display of one link in the chain. I can press the precedent arrow and establish sequentially all those precedents. But there's a way to visually display all of the cells that are involved in this calculation sequence at the same time. By pressing CTRL+SHIFT left bracket, I don't know the math involved, but I do know all the cells involved. And since I've selected all of the cells, I can fill those cells with a color, which is a great start because then I can go to the Formulas tab and left-click Trace Precedence and pretty cleanly display all the calculations that are happening to give me the value that's in H18. I know these two values must be obviously added together to get this value. I go to the next arrow and I can press F2 and get the formula that results in a value of -7. And then I can go to the next arrow, press F2 and get that formula, and then the next arrow, and so on. So I can pretty cleanly follow the calculation sequence throughout this sort of mangled mess of random numbers and random formulas. I can obviously go the other direction as well. I can trace the dependence at the beginning of the calculation stream, CTRL+SHIFT close bracket. I'll fill those blue again, and then I'll add my dependency arrows sequentially. And we end up with the reverse of what we had displayed before in a little less detail, but where all the arrows that terminate in a dot are, I have a formula that terminates in a dot, an arrow to a dot, an arrow to a dot, another formula, and so on. So that was tracing dependence and precedence using some Excel functionality. We first traced the precedence by starting it at a cell that was at the end of a calculation stream and sequentially pressing the Trace Precedence button to add directional arrows that reference cells in a cascading pattern that brought us to the value that for us was in cell F17. We removed those precedent arrows, and then we started at the other end of the calculation sequence and traced the dependence in the same way, and then we removed those arrows. We also found that coupling the arrows with the CTRL+SHIFT open bracket and close bracket keys can help with, one, selecting the cells that are either precedence or dependence, so that we can, two, format those cells and then add the precedence arrows or the dependence arrows and get a complete picture of the calculation sequence in the worksheet.